Welcome to a new edition of the College 12 Pack. I'm your host, Patrick Kahn, Senior Editor of the College Wires. With me, as always, Tyler Matuno, LSU Tigers Wire. And Tyler, I decided to put down the controller for at least an hour so we can sit down and talk SEC football with the SEC Media Days going on this week. Also, if you haven't heard, College Football 25 is officially out. Tyler and myself are going to be spending the weekend playing this game so we can talk about it next week. Tell you all the things we like, what we don't like, things you should be doing. But first, let's dive into the SEC talk. Much as we've done with the other Power 4 conferences, let's do our superlatives. And Tyler, I want to kick this thing off with the Offensive Player of the Year. I think there's so many low-hanging fruit options here, right? But I'm going to go with one that I think is a little off the wall, maybe not for some people. How about Jackson Dart, quarterback, Ole Miss, all those weapons around him? I think if Ole Miss is going to challenge for the SEC title, if they're going to challenge to make a deep run in the playoff, it's going to be on the shoulders of one Jackson Dart.
Jackson Dart's kind of an interesting case, I think, because, he really turned things around nicely last year. Like, he struggled quite a bit in 2022. Like, the production was there, but the efficiency was not, through, I think, 11 interceptions that year. He really cleaned things up this past season, I think, he's such a good weapon because of what he can do with his legs. We saw the production on the ground in terms of yardage dropped off a bit this past season, like in yards per carry. But he had 8 touchdowns compared to, I think, just 1 the prior year. So I think over 30 total touchdowns last year for Jackson Dart. Like you said, the weapons here are good. Like, they do lose Quinshon Judkins, which is tough, a very good running back that they're going to have to replace. But they have Ulysses Bentley, who saw a lot of carries even when Judkins was here. And then, I think you have to like the weapons, a receiver core that already has Trey Harris and brings in Juice Wells from South Carolina. Like, this offense could be really explosive this year. And I think, Jackson Dart's just such a dynamic quarterback. Like, I think, he's certainly not of the guys in the SEC, the quarterbacks that are going to get the most NFL draft hype. That's going to be Carson Beck. That's going to be Quinn Ewers. But, I think for what this team is and what they need him to be, like, Dart could be the best quarterback in the SEC this year. I don't think that's a ridiculous thought.
No, and going back to the 2022 game, talk about the Texas Bowl against Texas Tech. He turned the ball over 4 times in that game and essentially just handed the game to Tech. But if you were to tell me that same quarterback was going to go through the 2023 season and throw only 5 picks with 23 touchdowns, I think anybody would have taken it, but they probably would have side-eyed you a little bit because they're like, yes, Dart is exceptionally talented, but we haven't really seen it on a consistent basis. But I really like your pick here, and obviously you're going with a Missouri wide receiver. Once upon a time, he was an Oklahoma commit, decided to stay home, go to Missouri, Luther Burden, which I think is a fantastic pick when you factor in what he did last year, and then that receiving core coming back, that quarterback coming back, and I think with Drinkwitz calling the shots on offense, they're going to feature Burden a lot this season.
Yeah, Burden wasn't the best receiver in the SEC last year because Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors exist, but he was up there. I mean, breakout year for him, had 1,200 yards and 9 touchdowns. Like, you mentioned it, a former 5-star recruit, a guy that with talent, the likes of which that this Missouri program doesn't bring in that often, but they're bringing him in more often now under Eli Drinkwitz. And, I think there's a lot of optimism about this Missouri team this year with all they bring back, and deservedly so. And he's, I think sort of at the center of all of it. A guy that, I think it's really huge that they're bringing their quarterback back with Brady Cook. They had a nice connection last year. Like, I just think there's so much that's going to be turnkey with this offense this year. Like, I don't see how Luther Burden doesn't have as good a season as he had last year, if not better. And I think you're going to hear this guy talked about as maybe the top receiver in the draft, a potential top 10, top 5 kind of pick. And I think he certainly has that kind of talent. And we saw, a lot of flashes of it last year. I think he could be poised to have a huge year.
Yeah. The thing that I want to see is, it's not like Luther Burden caught people by surprise. But how does he do in year 2 when the expectations are much higher? Based on what Missouri did, whether you want to put an asterisk next to the win over Oklahoma or Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl or not, they still showed that they're a very talented team because that Ohio State team, even though maybe some of their starters weren't playing, they're still chock full of 5-star guys. So the talent was there. I want to see how he does this year. It'll be interesting to see some of the matchups that we're going to even see. Like Luther Burden was once an Oklahoma commit. Oh, and by the way, Missouri's going to play Oklahoma, a return of the old Big 12 out in the SEC or the Big 8. It's going to be an interesting matchup. Defensively, we're going to Tennessee with James Pierce. And I think this is a name that we've already heard a lot already through the offseason. If you're looking at 2025 mocks, Pierce might be one of the best defensive player in the SEC. He might be the best defensive player in the country.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen several mock drafts that have this guy going first overall. And I think it'll take a step forward for him to become that kind of player. I don't think he's necessarily there right now. But, when you look at the trajectory, you can really see it. He didn't play a ton as a true freshman in 2022, but was pretty impressive when he did, had a couple sacks, and then goes into last year and just, blows up, has a first-team All-SEC season, I think 9.5 sacks. I think you expect that production is going to only improve this year just because of how talented this guy is. And, like we've been saying, a guy that could be one of the top defenders in the draft when we're, in a couple months when we're looking at that. And, I think this Tennessee defensive line last year, the defense in general, but the defensive line specifically was a lot better than people gave it credit for. I think a lot of people like to talk about the Josh Heupel offense with Tennessee, and that's understandable. But I think this defense, when the offense had its struggles last year, the defense was actually the unit kind of keeping this team competitive. And, James Pierce was a big reason for how talented that front was. I think maybe my concern with him a little bit, this is probably more of a NFL concern than a college football concern, because I'm not sure how much it matters at this level. A bit undersized, if you look at him like a guy that kind of looks more like, a true outside linebacker than a hand in the dirt edge rusher. But, really athletic and great speed. So, a guy that could really wreak havoc, against SEC quarterbacks this season.
Yeah, and for me, I'm going with a player that you're very familiar with, and Harold Perkins. It's interesting. A lot of people talk about Harold Perkins taking a step back, but if you really look, his numbers are very similar to his freshman season. 13 tackles for loss. He had 1.5 sacks less than he did his freshman year. I think that had a lot to do with where they were playing and how they were playing him. So what I'm really interested to see is with Harold Perkins kind of go into that off-ball linebacker, edge rusher mold with Blake Baker, who comes back from Missouri. He's really going to be running that defense. But Harold Perkins was a guy that we knew was special. And if you go back and look his freshman season, that game against Arkansas, he took over, absolutely dominated that side. And that's why I think with Baker coming, run this defense, I think Harold Perkins is going to be a problem.
Yeah, that Arkansas game is kind of the one that put him on the map, but he had a lot of moments like that as a true freshman. I covered that team. Like he their teams could not block him even as a true freshman. Like he got in there pretty much every single time. And I think this time last year, we're talking about this guy as if he would be one of the best defensive players in all of college football. And it just didn't really work out that way. Like you said, like looking at the production, it's not like it was a stark drop off, but just watching the games, he was not having the same impact. They tried moving him to the middle last year. They moved him off the ball to middle linebacker, really just kind of middling success there. No pun intended. But, I think like you mentioned, coming in with Blake Baker, they're changing his role up a little bit. He's still going to be off the ball this year, it sounds like, but he's going to play more on the weak side. So that's going to give him more opportunities to rush the quarterback from the edge, which I think is what his strong suit is, certainly, at this point in his career. I think, my thing with Harold Perkins, and I'm with you, I think he has the ceiling to be as good as any guy we're going to talk about today. I still think that LSU might be doing malpractice in how they're using him. Like, I can't escape the feeling that maybe this guy just is best served being a straight up edge rusher. Like, line him up in the jack position, let him come off the edge and rush the quarterback most of the time, because that's when he was impacting games the most as a freshman. And like, I get it. This guy's ultra athletic. He can play in coverage, and you want to develop that. You want to develop him into a more well-rounded linebacker, both for, this team and for him at the next level. I get that. I just, he's going to need to be impactful in a way that he wasn't last year, because his freshman year, like you said, he just had games like the Arkansas game where he single-handedly won LSU that game. And even though he had his moments last year, there weren't really moments like that.
If I was Harold Perkins, I probably would have sued Matt House for coaching malpractice with the way that they played him last year. I have hope and faith that Baker will take advantage of what he does best, get after the quarterback, punishing hits, allow him to be just run around and wreak havoc on the defensive side of the ball. I think it's the best way to play him. Let's talk about newcomers of the year. Now, this is a little interesting because one newcomer that we have on our list didn't really leave the SEC, but he's on a new team. I'm talking about a certain wide receiver at the University of Texas.
Yeah, I went with Isaiah Bond for mine. And yeah, a little bit of a cop-out because he's not a newcomer to the SEC. Well, he's on a newcomer to the SEC, but he's not a newcomer to the SEC. But yeah, I mean, a guy that, to be honest, when I was doing the research for this, I was a little surprised that he only had 600 and something yards last year. Kind of felt like he had a bigger impact than that, especially, as things, as the offense figured things out down the stretch. I think he really proved how impactful he can be. And, to have that production in spite of, we kind of talk about where the offense with Jalen Milroe was by the end of the year. It's a little easy to forget. It was not good at the beginning. It had some serious problems. So I think coming into this Texas team where he's going to be the top weapon for Quinn Ewers, I would say. And, I have my questions about Quinn Ewers. There's a reason I didn't pick him as my offensive player of the year. But I think he's, I think it's an improvement in the quarterback situation. I'll say that. I like Jalen Milroe, but I think that Quinn Ewers will do a better job of getting the ball to Isaiah Bond here at Texas this year. So, I think, it could really be a nice piece for this team that's losing a lot of talent at receiver, with AD Mitchell and Xavier Worthy moving on. If you want to buy into Texas, which I think both of us kind of are, I think a big reason for it is because you believe that Isaiah Bond is poised to take a big leap to, elite production, be a 1,000+ yard receiver this year. And I think if he stays healthy, there's no reason I can see why he shouldn't do that.
Last year's team, Texas brought in a SEC wide receiver, and AD Mitchell, coming back to his home state of Texas, played at Georgia, played in some big moments, led the team this last year in touchdowns. So they've shown some success there, and we know what Sark can do with wide receivers. Now you bring in Isaiah Bond, and I agree. There's a lot to like about the Texas offense. And I know a lot of people who bring up, they lose Xavier Worthy. They're losing AD Mitchell. They lost Jordan Whittington, who's another weapon. And I think Isaiah Bond really fits in. They've got so many choices and options there at wide receiver between Bond or Matthew Golden, 5-star wide receiver Ryan Wingo, former 5-star signee Jonte Cook II. I mean, there's weapons all over the place, but I think it begins and ends with Bond. I think he's the most experienced, and I think he brings just another level to that room. But for me, I'm going on the defensive side of the ball for a newcomer down at Texas A&M. Nick Scorton, who comes over from Purdue last year, had 10 sacks, 15 tackles for loss, coming off the edge. I think he's going to do really well in that Mike Elko defense. Defensively, the Texas A&M defense this year should be really, really stout. And I think him coming off the edge is really going to help them.
Yeah, I am curious what this A&M defense looks like this year because, obviously, I think we both have utmost confidence in Mike Elko to build a really, really good defense. But with that being said, they had to portal it really heavily, and I know from the team that I follow, they took a couple of those guys from Florida, guys that kind of struggled at Florida last year that are probably poised to have to start this year for Texas A&M. So, we'll see how that works out. But where I will say they did pretty well, I think, is on the defensive line. Scorton's a big reason for that. Coming off a huge year at Purdue, had 10 sacks. I think you can feel pretty good about how that's going to translate to the SEC. My only question with putting him here in the newcomer of the year thing, will he potentially get production kind of, snaked away by another newcomer to the SEC that's going to be playing maybe on the opposite side of him and Cassius Howe? a Bowling Green transfer who had double-digit sacks last year himself. So, I think, you wonder which of those guys is maybe going to feast more this year, but I think you've got to like both of them. I think they were both great moves.
Yeah, and I struggled here because I wanted to say Trey Moore coming over from UTSA to Texas, kind of playing that jack role, something that Texas has really missed since Joseph Asai went to the NFL. But I think Trey Moore, Nick Scordon, I mean, there's a plethora of guys we could have won here with newcomer of the year, but that's kind of where I was leaning. When it comes to head coach of the year, I'm going to go with Kalen DeBoer, Alabama. I know this guy was AP coach of the year for the job that he did in Washington, leading them to the national championship game, beating Texas. But I think when you talk about the impact that he's going to have this year in changing the culture, not so much that what Nick Saban built is bad, but that's not Kalen DeBoer. And I think that having to come in, follow a legend. When I look at it, I think Alabama's going to be in the playoff. So I really think that they're going to return again. Not a big shock, but I think Kalen DeBoer overall of everything that he's having to deal with the portaling and the retirement, not having a full off season, so to speak. I think that he will do a fantastic job and really make his mark on Alabama football.
I mean, look, I really like Kalen DeBoer. He's won everywhere he's been. He's a proven winner, and he's done it at some places that it's not that easy to win. And now he's at a place where, comparably, it's pretty easy to win, I would say. I guess my hang up here is just like, what does a good season look like here in year one for Alabama? Because, I mean, if they go 10-2, that probably gets them into the playoff. That's also a down year by Saban standards. Like, does that get you coach of the year? I don't know. Like, I don't think, like, my hang up here has nothing to do with DeBoer or the merits of this team, which I think are both pretty good. Like, I think even this roster that lost a lot last year, a lot of portal guys left in the wake of Saban retiring. And obviously they always lose a ton of guys to the NFL. That's just a given. But they've done a good job of replacing the talent. Like, I like the roster. I think they're pretty good. I just don't know, like, what he's going to do that is that impressive to people. And to me, like, I feel like the much more likely situation is that this team, despite being pretty good, does take a step back just because of all the losses. And if you're sitting at 9-3, 10-2, that might get you into the playoff. But I don't know if that's good enough to make people in Tuscaloosa feel that great.
And it may not. It may not. But I will say you stole my answer, so I had to pivot.
Yeah, that's fair.
With you going with Texas Longhorns head coach Steve Sarkisian, which I think is a great pick. And coming into the SEC, there are going to be a lot of challenges that they're going to have to deal with. In the Big 12, it was a handful of teams you had to deal with who would give you a fight. In the SEC, it's almost every week.
Yeah, and I just Sark is a guy that I've kind of had to, hand up. I got this one wrong. Like, I didn't understand the hire at the time. I thought they rushed it. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me. And I thought after the first year, after they went 5-7, I was like, we'll see about this. And I wrote about him on a hot seat list going into 2022. Obviously, he's turned that narrative around completely, and I just really like the way he's built this program. I think they recruit high school really, really well. Texas always has, but I think they've taken it up a level from where they've been the last decade or so. And they've portaled really nicely. Like, maybe they're not pulling in the most like star-studded Ole Miss level portal class, but you don't need to because you're recruiting at a Texas level. They plug holes really nicely. They have the last couple seasons, A.D. Mitchell before. You're hoping it works out well with Isaiah Bond this time. Obviously, Quinn Ewers, even though that's a little bit of a different transfer situation, not to get into that, but I think he's done a really good job setting this team up to be successful, to win immediately in the SEC. And while I do think they're going to struggle, in terms of handling that schedule week in, week out, like, it's going to be a challenge, not to mention you've got a Michigan team you're playing early in the season in non-conference play. Like, the schedule is tough, but I think if they can be a playoff team, be a team that gets to the SEC championship game, and spoiler alert, we both kind of think they could, if they are, in that mix, like that to me is a no-brainer coach of the year for Sark, given how much people are saying, well, I don't know how they're going to handle the SEC. The SEC is a different beast. Like they're going to learn quick. If they just come in and are really good right off the bat, like I don't know what else you can say.
And it's not like this team didn't, let's just say go into Tuscaloosa and beat Nick Saban and the Tide at home to kind of prove like, hey, we're ready. It's going to be difficult, but I think with a veteran quarterback, with a staff that's been together, if you look at offensive staff, defensive staff, this Texas team, they have a bunch of leaders on that team, and I really think that based on everything that they have, that they're going to do well. So I'm not surprised that you went with Sark. Like I said, I had to pivot, but I was waiting for the ultimate surprise move, and you say Billy Napier was going to be the SEC Coach of the Year. But I don't even think you're willing to jump on that grenade.
No.
Let's talk surprises. This can be good, this can be bad, but Tyler, I'm going to start it off. Oklahoma Sooners, not as good as everybody thinks they're going to be. A team that's probably going to be in the top 25, a team that went 10-3 last year, but I don't buy it yet. And the reason why is I would feel a lot better if Dylan Gabriel was still your quarterback. But the fact is that you're going in now you've had to change your offensive scheme because Jeff Levy is now the head coach at Mississippi State. You have a new quarterback, Jackson Arnold, who's made one start and looked really shaky against Arizona in that bowl game. Mind you, it's a bowl game, and maybe not everybody was giving their best effort because it wasn't a premier bowl. That's fine. But still, a young quarterback who has one start under his belt going into the SEC in year one, I'm not ready to say that they're going to be really bad like 5-7, but I think 7-5 might be the ceiling for this team going into this year.
You think 7-5 could be the ceiling? I'm okay. I mean, I'm not quite as low as you are then, but I get it. I get where you're coming from. I think this team is going to have some problems in year one coming into the SEC. Like, kind of just for a lot of the reasons you mentioned. I mean, first of all, I think we both really like Dylan Gabriel. I think we really like the potential that he has at Oregon this year, and I think he was really good at Oklahoma. I think, yeah, Jackson Arnold, I'm not going to read too much into that bowl game because I think bowl games for the most part, you can toss them out one way or the other. People aren't trying, the rosters aren't real. Like it's just, I think to me, given a whole other offseason in the system and stuff, I'm not too concerned about that, but he is inexperienced and but he is inexperienced. Like you're right. And it's a lot of projecting. Like Oklahoma fans, I see them on Twitter. They're very optimistic about him. And I understand why. I would be too, but it's a lot of projection. And when you look at what's around him, it's hard to feel super confident because like this team just portaled like an entire offensive line, basically. They had a lot of losses there this past offseason. And as Deion Sanders knows quite well, portaling an offensive line in its entirety is not the easiest thing to do in the world. Jury's kind of still out on if you can even do that and get a capable offensive line. So, we're going to see how that works this year for them. And, I think the reason I don't think the bottom's going to fall out here. Like I would say maybe this is probably more like an 8-4 kind of team, although I could totally see 7-5. I think the defense should still be pretty good. I trust Brent Venables to coach defense. He's done that very well his whole career. And they return a lot of starters. Like this is a veteran defense. I think they're like 8th in returning production or something like that. So, you got to expect that unit's going to be pretty good. But man, the offense could take a pretty significant step back this year if Arnold, hasn't improved quite a bit in the last few months.
I think that stretch from September 21st through October 12th is going to tell you a lot about Oklahoma this year. They do get Tennessee at home, but that is a high stakes offense. I mean, Josh Heupel knows Brent Venables. Having played on that Oklahoma football team, having watched Venables, say what you want about Auburn's offense. Defensively, they're still pretty good year in and year out. So that's another strong defense they're going to have to play. And then obviously the game against Texas and Dallas. They get a little bit of a reprieve between the Auburn and Texas game with that bye week. But I think that's going to be a tough stretch. And then 2 weeks later, they got to play Ole Miss. So they're really going to have a tough stretch there. And then it doesn't get much easier because they finish against Missouri, Alabama, and LSU. So that's why looking at the schedule, looking at the inexperience, I think Oklahoma will be fine in the SEC. I don't think they're going to turn into Vanderbilt all of a sudden. But I do think that this year it might not go as well as fans hope. But I think by year two, you'll really start to build some momentum with Oklahoma in the SEC.
Yeah, like I think Texas is going to find a lot more success than, SEC originalists or whatever you want to call them think that they will. But like, yeah, I think Oklahoma is probably going to have a legit welcome to the SEC moment this year. Not really because of what the program is. I just think where the roster's at this year, it is just kind of shaping up to be a transitional year. That's not a great position to be in coming into this league for the first time.
But for your surprise, it is no surprise with who you picked. We're talking about the Florida Gators. Going into this year, now I know there's been some talk about hot seat, and maybe there's not really a hot seat anymore with how you can change your luck or change your outcome with the portal. But Billy Napier's got a lot of questions to answer, but you feel like we're going to find out a lot of those answers, and it's going to be a positive thing for the Gators this year.
Or at least it could be. Like, I tried not to be a homer here. I really did. But like, I truly believe everything that I'm about to say. Like, I'm not going to tell you what I think the record's going to be this year. I really don't know. It could easily be a 6-6 kind of thing. It just depends on how everything breaks out. But what I will say, I think this is a much better roster than people are giving this team credit for. I think it's not necessarily elite in many areas. Like, there's not a lot of all SEC candidates, I would say, on this roster. But I don't think there's really a lot of deficiencies either. Like, I think you can look across the board and feel pretty solid about the two deep almost everywhere, including, by the way, at the quarterback position with a guy in Graham Mertz that, I'm sorry. I understand he's not like a guy that's going to go win the Heisman, but he's not getting nearly enough discussion for what he did last year. I mean, led the SEC in completion percentage. Like, I know he's limited. He's not, there's some throws I don't think he is capable of making. And would you like to see, Florida's passing offense, open up a little bit this year? Absolutely. But I think they have a chance to do that with, bringing back Trey Wilson, a guy who really impressed last year as a true freshman, could have a big role in this year's team. Brought in Elijah Badger, a late transfer addition from Arizona State, who, despite being in a very rough offense there, was very productive, battled injuries. So we'll see how that one goes. Like I just said about transfer offensive line, they have some transfer pieces. So we'll see how that works. And then defensively, they've portaled a lot of starters. Joey Slackman, a UPenn transfer, Pup Howard from South Carolina. Like, they've brought in guys to, I think, flesh out this roster pretty well. And when I look at them, it's like, okay, we talk about the schedule and everyone talks about how tough that schedule is. And I get it. But like, I also think there's projection going on with that, because I think when you look at it, Georgia and Texas are really the only two games where you're like, yeah, this is just, unless Florida's way better than we think they're going to be, they're just not going to win these games. But like, are we really that sold on Texas A&M? Like, are we really that sold on LSU, Tennessee, Florida State, like Miami? I think all these teams that people are hyping up as really difficult games may not be quite as difficult as people are thinking, especially with Ole Miss is at home, LSU's at home. Like, I'm not saying this team's going to win 10 games and be in the playoff conversation. I'm not saying that. But I think it's more likely than not that they have a season people deem overachieving and Billy sticks around than it is that the floor falls out and this team goes 4-8 and he's gone. That's all I'm saying.
I will say they are the only team in the SEC that has scheduled 3 power conference opponents in their non-conference.
Yeah, I don't know why they did that. That was not very smart.
But, I mean, I think you're right. I think it could be better than some believe. But I think Eugene Wilson III or Trey Wilson might be one of the best kept secrets in college football. I think he's dynamic, and I really like Mertz, but I would like it even better if DJ Lagway was playing. Not that Mertz is limited, but I think Lagway just brings so much more as a runner as well. I mean, obviously, it could be similar to what we saw last year with Jaden Daniels, last 2 years with Jaden Daniels at LSU. He's that type of athlete. But let's
Um,
talk about the title game matchup.
sorry. Before, can I add one more thing on DJ
Go
Lagway
ahead.
before we move on? Yeah. So just two notes on DJ Lagway. First of all, he's gonna play this year. Like, I don't believe he's taking a redshirt year for a second. You're gonna see him on the field with design packages to take advantage of what he can do that Graham Mertz can't. I think that's the case. And also, we saw Graham Mertz got hurt at the end of last season, and I think Florida's defense played well enough to win that Florida State game, but the offense couldn't do anything. If a situation like that were to happen, I think you have to feel a lot better with DJ Lagway, even though he's probably not ready to be the full-time starter as a true freshman.
Could be very similar to Chris Leak, Tim Tebow type of thing back in 08 with the packages and the way that they use them. But let's talk about the SEC title game. We're both in agreement here. Georgia versus Texas. Now, we get this matchup in October, but we could potentially see this twice, and that has me excited. I just think looking at from a Georgia perspective, I think we have to automatically put them there because in the last 3 years, who has beaten Georgia? Only one person, one team. Nick Saban is the only coach that has beat him, and he beat him, I think, 2 out of 3 years. And so when I look at it, I really think they're going to be there. The thing for Texas is, can they navigate the rest of the schedule and get in? And I think they're talented enough to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if the counterpoint here is that it probably is not that likely that we'll see rematches in conference title games, even though we've predicted 2 so far, at least, or maybe 3. Yeah, we predicted 3 in doing our conference previews. But I mean, that is, that is going to be a limiting factor. Like, whoever loses that game, like the margin for error is like non-existent at that point. The loser of the Georgia-Texas game, if we're going to see a rematch of this. But like, I'm with you. I think these are the 2 most talented teams in this conference. Like, could you sell me on Alabama being that good? Absolutely. Could you sell me on Ole Miss being that good? Yeah, probably. But like, where things stand right now, I think these are the 2 most talented teams. And, it's hard. Like, it's like I've talked about, it's hard to make projections for Texas because you just don't know how they're going to handle it. But I'm pretty optimistic they'll be able to handle it pretty well.
Yes. And as far as our champion pick, we're both in the agreement once again. We talked Georgia versus Texas. We both have Georgia. I've kind of laid it out on why. Kirby Smart, he's kind of the head honcho of college football right now. And so I look at him. I think you look at his team. You have a year under Carson Beck's belt. That's why I'm going with UGA for all the reasons that I laid out. And I would not be surprised if Georgia runs the table again this year.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I'm with you on Georgia. I'll be honest, I chickened out here. Most of the offseason, I've kind of been saying that Texas was going to be my pick. I think I've even said that on the pod before. I couldn't bring myself to pull the trigger on that. Like, the more that I thought about it, I think Georgia is just hard not to have more faith in them right now. Given everything you just said about Kirby and their track record, but also I think just given that, I don't have complete confidence in Quinn Ewers. I do think that, you question the replacing those guys on offense, even though we both like Isaiah Bond. I think you question, losing some of the guys on defense, particularly up front, that they lost. And I think they've replaced those guys well enough to make a run. I don't know if they've replaced them well enough for me to tell you right now that I think this team that's never played an SEC schedule before is going to come in and win the conference in year 1. I'm just not quite there. But as we'll get into in a second, in the, starting this year, not as significant who wins the SEC, not quite as important as it has been in years past.
Yeah, it really isn't with the expanded playoff. And we're talking about how many teams can you get in? ACC 1, Big 12 1.
Yeah, I think that's what we both said. Yeah.
And then you get to the Big 10, you can see 3. So right off the bat, you have 5 spots gone, and there's still 5 or 6 more spots. With the Power Five or Power Five, the Group of Five champion is going to get in. It could be Notre Dame gets in as an automatic qualifier, but I'm going to go. I think we both went five here as far as how many SEC teams can get in. We differ on one. I got UGA, Texas, Ole Miss, Alabama, and LSU in the playoff. And you're with me up until that last one.
Yeah, I've got Missouri in there instead of LSU. And like to me, it's really as simple as like if they have the kind of season they had last year, they will be in the playoff. Like there's no doubt about it. And I think they could easily have the same kind of season they had last year. I think they brought back, a lot of key pieces. Like, you lose guys like Cody Schrader, lose a couple pieces on defense. Like that's not ideal, but they didn't lose anyone that I'm like, man, I don't know how they're going to replace that guy this year. Like they had a good offseason, good portal, good recruiting. It's hard not to be really optimistic about this Missouri team. And I'm certainly more optimistic about them than I am about LSU, which we're going to get into in a few minutes here.
Yeah, I went LSU because, well, frankly, I have been a Garrett Nussmeier fan from the jump. I think, having watched him in Flower Mound, Texas, I've seen him up close. I think he has the juice. We've kind of seen some stuff, but we saw it in the SEC title game against Georgia. We got to see him let it loose a little bit. Now, I know that game was well in hand, so, take from it what you will. I just look at LSU and I think, with the moving on from Matt House on defense, I mean, they had to do something there because that defense was historically bad. Bringing in Blake Baker, bringing in the defensive pieces that they brought in, moving around arguably one of the best defensive weapons at linebacker. I really like the way that Harold Perkins plays, so that's why I'm high on LSU, but I did struggle with LSU versus Missouri. I think Missouri ultimately gets there, but for argument's sake, I'm going to say LSU because as we go to our next part, who's the SEC original with the best season? And I wanted to stay away from the Alabamas and the Georgias, because I feel like that's easy. I went with the LSU Tigers for all the reasons that we just talked about. And again, I will just reiterate, I am a believer in Garrett Nussmeier. He may not have the weapons that Jaden Daniels had last year, but I still think that they have enough juice on that team to really make some headlines there. And I think CJ Daniels is going to be a really good wide receiver for this team going into this year. So for me, give me LSU.
So I agree that I think, have the juice offensively. You do. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable to say that I'm not that worried about the offense, given the fact that they're losing a Heisman quarterback that went 2nd overall, a receiver that went 6th overall, and a receiver that went 20-something overall to the Jags. I should probably know that off the top of my head, but I don't. But so they lose a lot of pieces on offense. But then you look at it and it's like, okay, well, they still bring back 4 or 5 starters on probably the best offensive line in the country. They bring back, a guy who seems like he's poised for a breakout at receiver in Kyron Lacey, plus another guy who seems like he's poised for a breakout in Chris Hilton, plus a 1,000-yard receiver in 2023 in CJ Daniels, a Liberty transfer. Like, yeah, like you can really buy this offense, even if the run game maybe, leaves a little bit to be desired, which it probably will. It's just the defense. Like they could be worse. I don't know if I believe they will be, but they could be because, I mean, they were awful last year and they lost multiple starters, especially the defensive line. I mean, with guys, Mason Smith, Mekhi Wingo, Jordan Jefferson, those guys are all gone now. And they didn't really portal that hard. This team, Brian Kelly's even said this publicly. Like they are putting their NIL emphasis and that's going to high school recruiting. And the results are good. They've got a top 525 class right now. So, if they close out the cycle strong, they could have a really, really good class coming in. But the result of that is, not really portaling that well. And, added a couple guys because they only returned 2 defensive tackles with game experience. Added a couple transfers, but one of them is a D2 guy. Like, you can be optimistic, but you're lying if you're telling me that you know how a Division II transfer is going to fare playing defensive tackle in the SEC. Like, there's just no way to know that until we get pads on and get in the games. So it's really hard for me, even though I do like the Blake Baker hire and I do like some of the pieces on defense. They're relying so much on development here that it's hard for me to believe they take a huge step forward. And even if the offense is fantastic, it's probably going to take at least a minor step back. So, like, I really think that this team could fall off to like an 8-4 or 7-5. I don't think that's likely, but I think it's certainly possible.
It is possible. And when you look at your original with the best season, I think they have to have a really strong season because this is probably Lane Kiffin's best shot at contending for a national championship going into this year.
Yeah, either I'm right and they're the original with the best season, or I'm wrong and it's kind of, a reckoning for Ole Miss. I mean, not like Kiffin's going to get fired, but like if they are going to elevate this, if they're going to take this thing to the next level, push it beyond where the kind of glass ceiling has been for Ole Miss the last few decades, it's got to be this season. I mean, you're coming off an 11-win season. You don't really lose, aside from Quinshon Judkins, like we talked about earlier, you don't really lose that much. And then you bring in, studs all over the place in the portal. Obviously Juice Wells we talked about, but then on defense, Walter Nolan on the defensive line, Chris Paul, a good linebacker, Trey Amos, a safety. Like, they are loaded. This is, from a blue chip ratio, an unthinkable level talented roster for Ole Miss. And I think, there to me is absolutely no reason that they should not make the playoffs this year. Like, I don't see any reason with a team coming off an 11-win season that only got better on paper. And by the way, when you look at their schedule, it really, for what a new SEC schedule can be in 2024, it's really not that bad. So to me, it's like, it's make the CFP, or like you might, like, maybe Lane has just literally pushed this thing to its absolute ceiling already.
And if that's the case, then he's probably going to have to take the Miami job if it opens up. Maybe Florida. That might be his best shot at taking this thing up if he's reached the peak that Ole Miss can do. And I feel like that was a conversation for the last few years, because I feel like with the expanded playoff, does it really matter if you win your conference or not? Because you can make a run if you get in, just get in and see where play the hand you're dealt. It may not matter, but we'll kind of see how it plays out. But I like your pick of Ole Miss. Now, going with the SEC originals, that's going to struggle. I went with LSU having a great season. You are on the other end, kind of playing devil's advocate there.
Yeah, kind of disagreement here. And I'm not going to reiterate, because I kind of just made my case for why I'm low on them a second ago. But, just to kind of hammer it home, like, I'm not down on LSU. And I'm especially, by the way, not down on the trajectory under Brian Kelly. Because I do think, like, if they can close things out with this class, they got a 5-star cornerback, the number 1 cornerback in America on Wednesday, maybe trending for a 5-star receiver. They're going to land on Saturday. So, like, the recruiting is really promising. They've got the number 1 quarterback and overall player in America committed in Bryce Underwood. Like, things could be really good here, I think, beyond 2024. And while I'm optimistic about Garrett Nussmeier, and I don't know what the quarterback situation looks like beyond this season, presuming that he leaves, I don't buy this team that much. I think there's a reason they started last year as a top 5 team. This year, those expectations are tempered. They're sitting outside the top 15 in a lot of rankings, and I think that's about right. And I think that while it's possible, I think if you're expecting this team to make a run to the college football playoff, I think you're underrating how difficult the schedule is going to be, and I think you're overrating a bit how much better this team got this offseason.
I think you make a fair point. Let me talk about the team I think that'll struggle. Is going to be the Auburn Tigers. Talked about them a little bit early about their defense and how they're consistently a pretty good defensive team. But does that really matter when your offense can't sustain drives, score points? And I think if and I'm not going to say that I know more than Hugh Freeze, but if he goes into another
I
season with
might.
Peyton Thorne playing predominantly most of the snaps at quarterback, I don't think Auburn is going to do much better than the 6-7 they did last year.
Yes, I disagree here a little bit. Like, I'm not like super gung ho on this Auburn team going into 2024, but I think, a little bit more optimistic about the Hugh Freeze trajectory. I think they'll be solid, to be honest with you. Like, I could see it working out. A lot of new pieces, I think, pretty much an entirely new receiving core between a couple portal guys and then Cam Coleman, who was a 5-star in the 2024 class that probably going to have to contribute on day one because this team's kind of lacking for skill position players, at least at receiver. Running back, they've got Jarquez Hunter coming back. Obviously the really tragic situation with Brian Batty. We wish him the best, but football is not really the thing on his mind or any of his family's mind right now. So, I think looking at them, I think you nailed it with Peyton Thorne. Like, that's really the only thing. If they had upgraded the quarterback situation, they might have been my surprise team, but they didn't. And I don't really believe in Peyton Thorne. I don't really understand why Hugh Freeze seems to believe in Peyton Thorne so much. He was kind of like they whiffed on Grayson McCall and a couple other guys 2 off seasons ago. When they landed him, he kind of seemed like he was just the best they could get at that time. Well, they were aggressive in a lot of ways this offseason, but not in terms of finding a better quarterback. So seems like we're running this thing back with Peyton Thorne, who's played a lot of college football. Most of it hasn't been that good. Last year was probably the worst of it. Like, yeah, maybe it can't get any worse, but I don't really see why this is going to get better. So, I'm with you in the sense it's hard to see a big leap just being in the SEC. But I think it's going to be positive trajectory. Like, they went 6-7 last year. Like, yeah, I think 8 wins is doable. Sure. Like, I think they could have that kind of improvement, but, and I don't think that would be disappointing per se, but I also don't think they're going to have a season where we're like, wow, this team's poised to be really good in 2025.
If their leading receiver is a tight end again, it's not going to be great, especially considering that tight end, Rivaldo Fairweather, only had 394 yards. Not great. I think, Cam Coleman's going to have to play immediately. But again, if I looking at their quarterback situation, if they don't figure some things out, I don't know how much faith I have in them getting better. And from a defensive perspective, if you're a defensive coordinator and you're going up against that offense, I'm not worried about Peyton Thorne throwing the football. So I'm going to gear up to stop Jarquez Hunter, Jeremiah Cobb in that running game. And that'll just make things even more difficult. They do have some options, although they are inexperienced options. But you figure with Hugh Freeze at the kind of being the offensive guy that he is, that he could figure out a way to build a game plan to help these guys out. But like I said, my whole idea of them struggling is based on the fact that who Peyton Thorne is playing quarterback.
Yeah, and again, it's just so frustrating. I'm not an Auburn fan, but just I'm frustrated for them because I think that like I said, you could really talk yourself into this team taking a significant step if they had done something to address the quarterback position, but they didn't, and that just seems like it's such a limiting factor here that I'm with you. Even if everything else goes well, this won't be an upper half SEC team, or at least a top 5 or 6 SEC team. Probably just because Peyton Thorne just does not have the juice, unless we see a 5th-year surge or whatever, kind of like a Jaden Daniels kind of thing. But I would not be banking on that happening.
I don't think so. I really don't. But that's going to do it for this edition of the College 12 Pack. Check back next week. Tyler and I will talk about College Football 25. And in the upcoming weeks, we're going to talk Group of 5 football. And Tyler, we got to get ready for the season. Football is right around the corner. Before you know it, we're going to be talking week 0. Florida State, Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland. There's going to be plenty to talk about. That's going to do it for this episode. We will see you next week.